Chapter 22. Wrong Side of History. Pain was beginning to swoop into his wrist and tingle into the fingers that were no longer attached to his arm. They had been driving maybe 15 or 20 minutes, but as the morphine gradually began to lose its effects, David found himself having a hard time keeping track of time as a whole new level of pain was threatening to engulf him. He was sweating, even though the Montreal night was chilly. He had also grown very quiet as the car moved through the night while he sat in agony. Chops told him there would be pain with the wound being so fresh, but David wasn't prepared for the excruciating pain in his remaining limb, as well as the non-existent hand. Now here it was, and all he could do was wish there was a way to go back in time and avoid whatever he slipped on in the alleyway. They had made it to an older section of Montreal, a part where it seemed nearly every other building was condemned or abandoned. The street lamps in this section were dark, and David wondered if they were part of the old electrical grid before the PowerPlants grid swept through the world. Dolly started to slow the car down as they reached another dark and old building's small parking lot. The sign on the building read, "Shoot 'em up Arcade," though with the neon of the sign long turned off, you wouldn't know until you were in the parking lot. She slid the car into park and turned it off. David took a double glance at the area they were in. "This is it?" he asked with shock in his voice. The two Nexes he met prior were both owners and operators of actual businesses. He highly doubted that this arcade was still functioning. Yup, this is the headquarters for Nex here in Montreal. Why? Expecting something obvious like a sign that reads, "Hey Fed's organization leader in here?" Dolly said, with a snide smile on her face. David winced as a wave of pain shot up from his wrist as he reached for his cigarettes. "I was expecting someone hiding behind the veil of a business, like Dolph does is all," he said as he lit a cigarette. "Nah, up here in the Canadian Commonwealths, even less people own property than the rest of the UCA. The Canadian government tried a lot of different things, or pretended to try different things before they let the UCA annex and absorb them," Dolly said. "So that means less likelihood of using a business to front without the Fed being able to come in anytime they want. So the Canadians have to get more creative, like hiding in abandoned buildings no one remembers, like an old arcade." David looked back up at the derelict building. "Welp, no need to stand on ceremony. Let's see what the Nex has for us," David said as he opened the passenger door. As the three of them got out and walked towards the door, David spotted a camera overlooking the front of the building. When Dolly got up to the door, she knocked. There wasn't an answer initially, then her burner phone went off. "Yeah," she said, rolling her eyes as she answered. "No shit, Nex, it's me. Yeah, they are with me. They are with us, don't worry. Just open the door. Nex, it's cold," she said with annoyance creeping into her voice like a teenager responding to a nagging parent. She let out a frustrated breath of air as she ended the call, followed by the sound of locks sliding open on the other side of the door. As they stood in the cold waiting for the final lock to be disengaged, David could feel the cold settling into the wound on his left arm and the stinging fire sensation that came with it. "If this is how people get hooked on morphine, I totally get it," he thought to himself as he gently rubbed the sides of the stump with his right hand. The door finally opened, and a pox-marked teenager stood on the other side. He had greasy long black hair that hung down into his acne-scarred face. Apparently, these scars had not convinced the teenager to step up his hygiene game, as his face still had what looked like a fair amount of dirt smudges mixed with a thin layer of oil. He wore some 1990s rock t-shirt under an old flannel. His chin looked like it recently had a fight with a peach and took the fuzz from it. When he opened his mouth and spoke, the voice was something you might expect to hear from a stuffy-nosed cliché geek. "Hey, Dolly, still sexy as always, I see," the kid said. David looked at Brick with his right eyebrow raised. Even Brick had an expression on his face. Whether that was from annoyance or confusion, David wasn't totally sure. One thing was certain, Dolly was maybe sexy 15 or 20 years ago, but David wasn't sure he would rate her as sexy as she was now. "Hey, boy, is Nex in there?" David asked. He was hoping this kid was just some hired help or something. Kind of like how Anna, the teenage blonde girl in STL, helped Jason at the charge station. The boy stared at him like he was part of the short bus brigade. "I'm Nex. Sorry if you were expecting some old useless bag of bones. Dolly, who are these guys exactly, and why are they here?" The teenage Nex stated, looking at David Stump, then at Brick, and finally back at Dolly. They are the runners of a big shit job I joined in on. But we hit a snag. We need your help, Dolly said. David began to feel a little weak again. Hopefully, when the time came to use Dr. Chop's medically safe crank-ups, they would perk him up. Otherwise, he was likely to pass out just from running to cover in a gunfight. Look, man, you can do your nerdy insults of us all you want. Just please let us come inside and sit down while you do it, David said. He was growing wobbly already. It was shocking how it was only just his hand. Yet the damage was so extensive, he felt nearly useless. Ugh, is this one like dying or something? The little dweeb said, sparking a flash of anger in David's head. His eyes focused on the kid. Nah, not yet, man, but I sure could use a goddamn seat all the goddamn same, David said, while Brick chuckled in the back. The teenager looked up at Brick, then back at Dolly. Shit, all right, come in then, he said, and the three of them shuffled in. David was able to make it to the area where the nerdy teen must have spent a large amount of his time, the game area next to 1980s-based arcade games. The kid sat down at a cheap desk with a computer that was lit up and splashing an eerie glow from the screen over the mostly dark and deserted-looking arcade. David eagerly sat down in one of the seats near the desk and took a few focused breaths as he wiped sweat from his brow. So, what brings you and this ragtag-looking couple here, Dolly? There's no chance it's got something to do with all the chatter I've been getting tonight, is it? The teen next said. What chatter is that next? Dolly asked, and even David's ears perked up to hear what the kid had to say next. The teenager shrugged his shoulders. Well, there's been talk of back-alley gunshots on the Montreal police radio. There's word that a group of hounds picked up some prey. Even some chatter about men in suits touching down at an airport, the kid said with that nasally, nerdy voice. David took the cigarette in his mouth out, holding it between two fingers, and then rubbing the temple of his head. The kid was adding to his headache, and the anger he felt welling up inside was going to come flowing out onto this greasy teenage geek at any moment. He decided to cut to the chase, to avoid closing the door of opportunity with his anger. Look, the gunfight was us. It was hounds. They did get two of our people. We need to get them back. Our plan can't go down without them, David said, following it up with a drag of his cigarette. We need to know where the hounds are. We need to know where the men in suits are, because I am pretty sure they are some SDT agents that are becoming our biggest fans, and we need as much firepower as you can give us. Dolly stepped in closer. Nex, how did the hounds get in Montreal without any heads up? She asked. The wispy greaseball shifted his eyes up at her. I did get a heads up. I got the heads up the day they came into town a week ago. They are some hick squad that has its roots in the Midwest Commonwealth region. They call themselves Union Hunters. Real typical case of hounds, super duper into Union patriotic crap, and all about buzzing out of their minds with whatever hardcore dope they can get their hands on. The teen next said, You would have also got the heads up if you reported in more than once a dang month, Dolly. David could tell she had insulted the kid. He must take his job seriously, if what she said had that much of an effect on him. You mentioned men in suits at an airport. What is the story there? David asked. The kid's face turned back to meet David's. Means what it sounds like. I got drummer boys all over, in places no one thinks to look. My sources reported about 4 hours ago, a private jet landed at Montreal Airport, and 2 suits came out. One built like some linebacker with a real clean black suit, the other short and stout with some cheap, wrinkled suit on. Both got in a Fed black car and took off. He paused for a moment to take a swig of some green juice or soda he had at the desk. But here's the interesting part. About 20 minutes ago, 2 guys matching that same description walked into a hotel lobby and rented 2 rooms for the night. No one else with them. The acne-scarred teen's face had grown a wide smile, showing his small yellow teeth. You're saying they haven't picked up our people yet? David asked, leaning closer to the kid. If those guys are your SDT fan club, then that's what I'm saying. They haven't picked up anyone yet, said the teen next. David looked at Brick, who slightly nodded his head, affirming he was good to go. Then he looked at Dolly, who seemed as shocked as David was that the agents left the opportunity wide open. Please, David started, please tell me you know the location of the hounds, Nex. David pleaded. He saw Ashley's face run through his mind as he waited for a response from the teen boy. Yeah, I think I know. It's easy to get some recon done on a group like them. There are maybe 20 of them that came to Montreal, and all you need is some drummer boys who are in the underworld of narcotics to find out where the hounds hold up. There's a warehouse, abandoned and old. The likelihood they are shacked up there for the time being is highly likely. The kid said he sounded like he was telling them how to go off and die. Then he looked up again at them. Before I give you access to any weapons, I need you to understand acquiring them, and the ammo for them isn't easy. You want the goods to rescue your team for your special big mission? I need to know what the mission is, flat out, or I ain't giving you shit, said the teen next. David had to hold for a moment as a fresh spark of pain flashed in his wrist and non-existent hand. We tell you, you can't advertise it to no one. Understand? Stated David. The teen next just nodded, as if this was a usual request. David looked around for a moment. We are hitting a power plant. One of the guys that got tagged in our group is our hacker. He's our best shot at finally blowing the whole system wide open, David said. The look of shock and excitement on the young man's face told David all he needed to know. Within 5 minutes, the teen was walking them down to the arcade's basement. They found an assortment of weapons they could use. They slapped on some bulletproof vests for protection. They even found some C4 and grenades. The C4 would give them a huge upper hand if they could get in before the fighting started, and booby-trap some choke points. Then, the teen next grabbed a pistol, unlike any David had seen before. David noticed it had a longer clip as Nex handed it to David. Since you are minus a hand, I doubt you plan to take a rifle or shotgun into this ordeal. But this pistol is automatic. You just hold down the trigger and it sprays until you let go. The recoil shouldn't be too bad if you don't try to empty the whole clip at once, but it should also give you a little bit more effectiveness than a regular old pistol. David took the gun and examined it more closely. It was all black and the barrel was a little longer, as was the clip, but otherwise, you wouldn't notice it was fully auto. Once they were stocked up, they got back in the car, all the ammo, guns, and explosives they thought they would need. By David's count, the teenage next said there were about 20, and if Brick and Dolly killed 6 earlier that night, that should mean there was anywhere between 13 and 15 left overall. It was a little over 2:30 in the morning, and it was a 10-minute drive to the warehouse the pockmarked Nex had told them about. The likelihood that most would be sleeping or buzzed out on some brain-melting drug was high, and as a result in their favor. Since David found out that it was only a 10-minute drive from where they were, he popped one of Chop's crank-up pills, hoping it would help him function better in the heat of a fight. They were in such a rush to get to Ashley and Trace that David realized he didn't have time to ask Montreal Nex how he ended up as the lead of the resistance here. As they started the car to head out towards the warehouse that Ashley and Trace were most likely being held at, he looked over at Dolly. That kid, how'd he end up running the Montreal spot? David asked as she started to pull the car out of the parking lot. She smiled at the question. That little twerp? He was a little shit when he was a little kid. Parents were asking for someone to come and re-educate him. But he was hip with tech, and since he refused to take his Chembal his entire life, he ran away from home. He showed up on the Montreal scene about, 2 years ago maybe. The guy that had been running as Nex up here got popped by the local PD for his other business ventures. Montreal had a lot of people step up trying to take the title, but he was the only one that seemed to know everything going on. It didn't take long after that for him to lock in the official title. As she spoke, David felt his heart beginning to pound a little faster. The pain in his left arm wasn't going anywhere, but he found that his senses were becoming slightly more acute. Shit's kicking in, David thought to himself. He remembered what Chops had said back in the sewer. Don't take another for at least another 4 to 5 hours. David assumed that was to avoid either overdosing or speeding up the addiction process that no doubt came from overusage. They drove the next 5 minutes in silence, each preparing for this 3-man assault in their own way. David hated to admit it to himself, but he was realizing he may be the weak link in this team now. What good would a one-handed man be in something like a shootout? He couldn't handle any two-handed weapons if he was going to use any of the grenades they brought along. He would have to holster or put his gun down so he could use it. And if they needed to carry one or both Ashley and Trace out of the place, he wasn't going to be able to as much as a someone with both hands. Hell, even loading a gun was going to be problematic for him. They rolled up to the parking lot of the warehouse, The building looked like a giant tetanus shot waiting to happen. But then again, earlier tonight he had been apparently drugged through a damn sewer, with a giant gaping hole in his wrist, where his hand was attached once. So who was he to throw stones? He looked over at Dolly, who had stopped the car a far distance away from the parking lot entrance. Probably would be smart to kill the headlights and try to scope out whatever defenses they may have up right now, David said. Brick leaned forward from the back seat. They most likely know you lost a hand. They may be thinking we ain't going to try anything so fresh after our last meeting, Brick said. You know, Brick, David said, looking back at him. Every time I think I got you pegged, you come along and do or say something that really makes me realize you keep your cards close to your chest. Brick's metal teeth shone ever so slightly through a small smile. A fool lets the world know how his mind works, hermano, he said. David turned back to face the warehouse and considered the situation. But he had to admit, he didn't know any Spanish, and he had no clue if hermano was Brick's way of insulting him or being nice. Truth be told, he didn't want to know he always got nervous when asking Brick too many personal questions. All right, Dolly started. Let's go ahead and get out here, grab the gear, and sneak up as close as we can. We got some sights to look through to get an idea of outside defenses, she continued. They hopped out of the car and closed the doors as quietly as they could. Brick opened the trunk where the weapons had been stashed and grabbed a duffel bag. David did the same, not as gracefully, but nonetheless, he did. They moved to the edge of the parking lot behind some overgrown half-dead bushes. As they sat there, David noticed that Brick's immense size made it hard for the man to shelter behind the shrubbery, as well as he or Dolly, and let a small smile cross his face, thinking of how the image of the large man poking out of the bushes might look if you were a guard. Dolly was looking through some binoculars while they crouched in the cold, dark night. The crank-up was really starting to hit David now. He could hear animals moving around in the wooded area across the street, and although his joints ached from pain and cold, he felt very alert. He took a deep breath to center himself some. He didn't want to let the upper take hold too quickly and punk him out before the whole thing even started. Looks like a ghost town over there. No one is outside, like no one, Dolly said. Her body was also beginning to shake from the cold. The only thing she wore was a hoodie and a bulletproof vest underneath it. Brick still had a jacket he got from Dolph's place earlier. David lost his after he passed out in the alley, and no one had mentioned where it had gone. All right then, what's the play here? Besides freezing off our nuts staring at a rust bucket building? David asked impatiently. He was trying to stay calm, but the idea of being so close to the place where Ashley was being held captive by some hobunk junkies made him anxious. My money's on the fools are all either strung out celebrating or sleeping like unknowing cattle, Brick said in his best impression of a whisper. Honestly, the man didn't have an ounce of stealth in his metal-grafted bones. David was amazed that of all the times they could have got screwed over during this whole thing, it was out in the open. That was supposed to be what Brick was best at. A plan began to form in David's mind. If what Brick is saying is true, then that means we have an opportunity here. Not just a marching guns blazing opportunity, but a tactful one, he said to the two of them. What's the tactful opportunity then, sugar? Dolly asked. We brought the C4, didn't we? I say we put some wire to go off along a few spots on the outside that look ready to come down already, and the rest inside. By the time we set it all off, the morons will be confused and dazed. Then we pull out the guns, David said with a pointedness in his voice. Maybe it was just the crank-up in his system really starting to take hold, but he was starting to regain some of the composure he had lost after the DOE hit, and it felt good. He is not wrong, Dollface. I can do the outside since sneaking around ain't my fucking bag. You two go inside to place some shit around the joint. Before we set anything off, we meet up in the entrance area lobby. Then we say hello to the hounds with a big fucking boom, said Brick. Dolly mulled it over for a second, then looked over at David. Think you can do that with just the right hand? Dolly asked David. I know how to set up smart C4. You just point to the side you take once we are inside, and I'll go the other way. David replied. The aching pain in his left wrist was now being overshadowed by his adrenaline. David used this type of C4 in basic training drills in his mandatory military service. Everyone at the boot camp he was sent called it Smart C4. C4 for a long time was an explosive that either needed to be set to go off with a form of boot-of-be trap or a small detonator jerry-rigged to it. Smart C4, however, had a remote chip applied to the top side of its shell. All one needed to do was to flip the toggle on the chip to detonate, and the chip would not go off until a remote button that matched the frequency was hit. Unless, of course, some blunt force was applied to the shelling, then of course, like most explosives, it would go off. The three then pulled out the weapons and ammo they each had chosen for this assault, took a bag of equal number of C4, and began to move in on the warehouse. There was no noise as they moved as quickly as they could in silence, aside from Brick's larger body thuds and the sound of small animals in the area. Once they got up to the building's wall, they stopped there. There was no noise coming from the area where they stood, no sound of someone rustling around. "All right, Brick," David said, looking over to Brick. "Go ahead and get started. Dolly and I will go through the front door. If there's a guard, well, hopefully we can take him out before any noise is made." Brick nodded as he turned to begin to circle the building to plant around weak points in the rotting building. David turned his attention to Dolly. "I can't pick locks, and I'm willing to bet that door is locked up like a monk's cock in his robes." "Think you can open it?" David said. Dolly covered her mouth to silence a laugh. "Shit, sugar. After I'm done with that monk, his dick will be as free as his soul," Dolly replied, and she turned to face the lock. As she was fiddling with it, David could hear the tumblers of the lock giving way to her. "Shit," David silently thought to himself. Maybe she could get a monk's dick out after all. Then the sound of a latch released, and Dolly looked up in silent satisfaction. They opened the door ever so slowly, the hinges of its metal frame giving out a small squeak. David's face wrinkled up as the sound came from the door. The door was open enough now they both could slip in. David pulled a knife from his belt. His senses were on high alert, and he held his left numb up, instinctively trying to hold up his hand to tell Dolly to wait. He moved into the dark entrance hall first. His eyes were adjusted to the dark thanks to the time spent outside for as long as they had been. The hounds must have just recently moved into this building. It was as cold inside as it was outside. The smell of the place was a mixture of musty dirt and a kind of old oil scent. Clearly, they didn't mind too much, or they would have either picked a better hideout or taken care of the smell. David looked around the entrance and saw what he was looking for. A guard had in fact been stationed at the front door, but the hour was late, and he found himself a not-so-comfy-looking chair to sit and sleep in. David realized this guy was probably the one who always got door duty in this little shitty outfit and had never had anyone show up unannounced. Which meant he had gotten so relaxed in his duties, he felt he could pass out on the job from time to time. All the better for them, David turned to face the door, put his finger to his lips to warn her to be quiet, and waved Dolly inside. As she slowly stepped next to David, he pointed at the sleeping guard. A shotgun lay next to the chair he was in. David then began signaling to Dolly the plan quietly. He hoped she would understand as he pointed at Dolly, then put his hand over his own mouth. He then quickly gestured to himself and his knife, pulling it out and making a slashing motion. Luckily for him, Dolly acknowledged her understanding of his hand signals. She nodded her head, and the two of them began to move silently towards the creeps. Dolly got right behind the back of the chair. Her job was made easy by the guard, as his head was already hanging back, exposing his neck. When David was in position, they stared at each other in the eyes, doing an internal countdown with each other. Then Dolly quickly but quietly clamped her hands down over the guard's mouth, locking his head in its backwards dangling position. The man's tired eyes opened somewhat slowly, but before he even had time to blink them, David moved into a position where he could run the knife deeply along his jugular. As the blood began to pour out, the look of horror and confusion set into his now very awake eyes. He tried to move, but with Dolly pulling his head back while she clamped his mouth shut, all he did was to make the deep cut open even more so. Before he even had a chance to try, standing, his eyes glazed over, and his body began to twitch. David knew he was already dead. They dragged his body over to a corner. Once they entered the large open warehouse floor, David noticed that somewhere off in the back of the warehouse, there was the sound of some new wave country being played. But he didn't hear people talking over the music. Dolly silently patted David's left shoulder and then pointed at herself, and then in one direction. David nodded and pointed at himself in the exact opposite direction. He held up 5 fingers, and Dolly nodded and took off. David rolled his eyes at himself as he realized that if he meant to give them more than 5 minutes, she wouldn't have known since he only had 5 fingers left. He moved as quietly as he could, which he noticed was shockingly quick and graceful, even for him. Those pills are pretty damn good, David thought to himself, but he was dreading the eventual come-down once the drug wore off. He slipped around the east side of the building, placing C4 in spots he knew would cause either larger explosions or cause the most structural damage. He also wondered how well Brick and Dolly were doing at their placement. Just then, it struck him that if they placed these too good, they could bring the whole damn place down before they got Ashley and Trace out. Well, shit. That would make all this a moot point. Even worse, what if it killed Ashley and it was his fault? He began to place the C4 in less devastating places from that point on. Better safe than sorry. He used his adrenaline-focused energy to make a quick detour after he placed his C4. He was confused as to why nearly no one seemed to be around other than the initial guard. It was a ghost town. As he was turning around a large shrink-wrap machine, he saw a hound member sitting against the machine sleeping, a recently used needle laying near the man's gun. David left some C4 under the machine just to make sure that junkhead wouldn't be causing problems later. He found his way to the area the music was coming from, that god-awful new wave country music. David wouldn't consider himself a huge country fan, but one thing he knew he could say is whatever this sound was, it wasn't country. It had the same bass beat as club music, and the voice had an artificial studio inserted southern twang in it. The sound made David want to kill the leader called Reese even more. He tiptoed closer to the area and saw why they hadn't seen much of anyone. Brick had called it. Nearly all of them were in this back office area. Getting drunk or high for hours on end, it looked like they had arrived at the point where the party was dead, and only a few heavily inebriated remained awake. David saw 2 doors shut, whereas the other offices had been left wide open for the hounds to run around and party. Ashley and Trace, David thought to himself. It had to be. Why else shut 2 doors when the rest were left wide open? David turned around and went back to the way he had come from. No need to risk taking a shortcut and possibly raising an alarm or alerting a guard, not when they were this close. He met up at the front door with Dolly and Brick. He leaned in towards them. Found a back area with offices. Most of the fools looked to be back there drunk or high out of their minds. Lots of them looked to be sleeping, but a handful were still awake. 2 doors back there were shut. I think it's where Ashley and Trace are being held, he told them. Brick nodded his understanding and Dolly agreed it made sense. Keep 'em close, right? Where would you shack up if you chose to stay in a place like this? Bet the office area has some real nice cheap carpet, she stated as she pulled out the detonator and looked at the 2 of them. Ready? She asked. Brick lifted his weapon of choice tonight, a modified Tommy gun with a larger drum for ammo. David pulled out the full auto pistol and released the safety with his index finger. Then, boom. The force of the blast threw everyone, even Brick, off his balance. The 3 of them planted their respected C4 well, and in no time, half the building on the west side collapsed. The sounds of mini explosions all throughout the factory went off from where old oil ran machines reacted to the C4 going off. The sounds of agonizing screams and confused shouts soon followed. Brick, being the sturdiest as well as dangerous, went through the entryway first, followed closely by David, and then Dolly, who was using 2 Uzis like she was from an action movie in the late 1990s. Apparently, there had in fact been some other guards throughout the warehouse floor, as David noted 3 men running around on fire. He began to make mental notes. 20 or so arrived in Montreal, 6 dead in the alley, 13 to 15 left. The guard at the door, 12 to 14 left. The one wasted by the machine we just blew up and the 3 running around on fire, 8 to 10. The last one better be fucking Reese. The 3 of them swiftly found their way to the office area as fire and building pieces rained down throughout the building. Then a group of 5 hounds came bustling out from the offices. 2 of the fools didn't even think to grab a gun. The sheer look of shock, confusion, and drunkenness covered their faces, making them easy targets. David lifted his right hand, holding the full auto pistol, crossed his aim so that he could spray bullets over the area they were standing at in a straight line, and fired. The 2 unarmed hounds went down as well as one holding a rifle. Brick and Dolly began to fire at the remaining 2 hounds that were still standing. It didn't take long for them to go down. 5 brought down in a hail of bullets, 3 to 5 left. Reese better be here, David thought to himself. His adrenaline and anger meeting up inside his chest to give him a new feeling of sheer drive he wasn't sure he could find a way to put into words. As they made it to the office area doorway, Brick paused to study the 5 men that had fallen. 2 were still alive, though struggling. Brick promptly lifted his giant foot and made one of them watch as he crushed the other injured man's head. Then shortly after, did the same to him. Normally, this might make David feel sick, but the pain these people caused him and the horrors they no doubt had done in the past blinded him to what Brick was doing to them as they fell. As they entered the office area, it was clear the fire had found its way to this area as well. David looked at the office at the very end of the hall. It appeared to be the largest office. David also noticed that it appeared to have fallen in on itself, and fire had begun to spread to the collapsed area. David heard Brick's Tommy gun go off into one of the offices as 3 more men fell. 3 more. Either no one is left or just 2. Reese better be alive, David thought. Then he looked at Brick and Dolly. Come on, he yelled over the sound of the fire and the building failing. We got to get these doors open and hope this is where they are. David looked at the first closed door and, aiming his right foot at the position of the door just a little to the side of the handle, kicked it in. The old wood gave way to his kick and flew open. On the other side of the door was Ashley, bound and gagged, terrified, but alive. David felt nearly all the wind rush out of his body, and he ran over to get her out of the chair. He looked back at Brick and Dolly. Ashley's in here. Check the other room for Trace. He yelled. He heard Brick tearing down the other door, but he was focused on freeing Ashley from her restraints. It's all right. See, you didn't actually think I wouldn't come get you, did you? He said to her as he cut through her ropes. He could see her body shaking at the sight of him. He put on a smile for her as the building began to moan in protest of its fate. Come on, you know me better than that, he said, holding a smile. After he got her ropes and gauge undone, she jumped to kiss him. Then the sound of Brick's voice interrupted the moment. Hey, we got the hacker. We gotta go now. Came his gravelly voice in the highest range he could get it. Ashley looked into David's eyes, then down at his hand, and somehow she found fresh tears. David knew there wasn't time for that now, and grabbed her with his right hand to lead her out. They began to head towards the exit when David came to a halt. He heard screaming, and he heard it from the office at the very end of the hall. Help me! Oh God, is anyone out there? I'm gonna die! Came the all too familiar voice. Brick! David yelled. Brick turned around, Trace on his shoulder. The fuck now? Brick asked. You got that big-ass knife of yours? David asked, not taking his eyes off the back office. Yeah. Why? Brick asked. David found it funny that Brick couldn't piece it together, although maybe he didn't hear the screaming through the sounds of the building falling and the fire. David turned to face the team. Let me borrow that real quick, you guys' head out. I shouldn't be too far behind, David said. David, Ashley croaked. We need to get out of here. This building is going to come down any minute. Her voice was strained, and David could tell she, like the rest of them, wanted to leave. He looked at the area around them. I'd say we have 10 minutes before the fire and the building structure gives way. I have plenty of time to do what I gotta do. The knife, please, Brick. I'll be right behind you, I swear, David stated with his right hand extended. Brick looked at Dolly and Ashley, then handed David the knife. It was huge and wickedly sharp. Then they all turned to leave, except Ashley, who stayed put for a minute to watch with concern as David turned and marched toward the back office. Once he got inside the stinky hot room, he saw a sight that spurred the old anger and hate inside his gut. Underneath some rubble, with a fire slowly inching its way towards him, was Reese, the leader of the now defeated Union hunters. David moved over towards the defeated Reese, and as he fell into the man's line of sight, the bounty hunter looked up in shock. Nash, he said with disbelief in his voice. You were expecting a guardian angel or a messiah, David said coldly. He was letting the hate and anger he felt inside for this man burn away at him like the fire eating the room. Look, Nash, you gotta help me. None of my guys touched the girl all right. I promise I made sure no one touched the girl. And as for the hand, you know that wasn't me, right? Right? Reese's voice had a level of panic already in it, but the look in David's eyes was causing it to become more comical in pitch. David crouched down, putting his left arm forward, showing the stump that sat in place of what was once a hand. "You don't think you did this?" David asked. "Wasn't it you with the cuffs? Chasing us?" David asked. The cold sound in his voice was being replaced by the fire he was feeling inside. He felt the sweat drop from his brow from the heat of the room. Reese looked at him in terror. You're a terrorist. You all were terrorists. We was just doing our patriotic duty and trying to make a living at the same time. It wasn't nothing personal, I swear." Reese pleaded with a quiver in his voice. David shook his head in disbelief. "Terrorist? Patriotic? Nothing personal? I got news for you, Captain Yeehaw. We are terrorists because we didn't want to be drugged up and because we asked too many questions. You think you are patriotic because you hunt and torture people for a living. Newsflash, asswipe. You made it personal when I woke up -5 fingers." David spat, the venom in his words growing with each syllable. He could see in Reese's eyes that he knew David saw through his bullshit. "I'll be honest with you, Reese. One of us stands on the wrong side of history, but we both should stand on our sides equally. Are you right-handed or left-handed?" David asked, and he saw Reese's face go white in fear. "Come on, man. It ain't gotta be like this. Come on, please don't do this," Reese pleaded. He was beginning to cry, but David didn't care for his tears. "Right or left?" David said again. Reese looked down at the cheap office carpet. The fire was drawing closer now, and the smoke was becoming very thick. I'm right-handed," Reese finally said between sobs. David used his foot as soon as Reese spoke and punted Reese in this side of the head twice. The bounty hunter leader went limp, and David then straightened Reese's left hand out, and with one solid thrust, brought down the same knife used on him on Reese. He wasn't a complete monster, though. After David made things even with Reese, he used the waning adrenaline rush to yank the man out from under the rubble. He left him clear of the line of the fire. If Reese was able to wake up in time, he could avoid the building falling in around him and possibly get to help before he bled out. He turned and made his way to the exit to join his team and Ashley.